You were just mentioning somebody asked you a question. Do you ever think all Christians will see eye to eye?
Yeah, actually, it was Josh. We were having a conversation. So it's my son Josh, who's also on staff here at Allison Park Church, and we were having this conversation about the tensions in the culture. And he asked the question very sincerely. Do you ever think there'll be a time in our lifetime when the church will again be all on the same page? Now, maybe that's naive to think that we ever were all on the same page. Maybe we were never on the same page and we just never really discovered it until the last 18 months. But will there ever be unity again around some of the things that we need to have unity around? And my answer...
All right. Hey, welcome to the Allison Park Leadership Podcast, where we cover the principles behind the plans. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Dave.
And my name is Jeff. Of course, I'm the lead pastor at Allison Park Church, and Dave is my son and also the campus pastor at the Northside campus of Allison Park Church. We're glad you're joining us today.
And this has been a summer of some fun topics.
Yeah, we have had a great time, honestly, the last couple topics we've shared together.
Yeah, in case you've missed it and you want to take a ride on the wild side, as they say, with pastors talking about weird stuff. We talked about aliens a few episodes ago, which was really fun.
Aliens, science, and the future of Christianity. That was the topic if you're looking it up.
Yeah, and I had a lot of people that were like, man, seeing your dad talk about aliens is crazy. They're like, I'm not sure you believed it, but yeah, so that was wild. And the last time we talked about weed, right?
Yes,
Christianity and cannabis, right?
And a lot of good feedback. I had actually pastors from around the world that texted me or emailed me and said they appreciated that particular podcast. So that's good. I'm glad. We're hitting on questions that I think are relevant to where people are. And I think one of the things that's really been great about this is just the fact that we have such a familiarity, of course, as father and son, and we have these conversations on the side. So we just kind of record, in a way, some of our own dialogues about some of these things. It's great.
Yeah, these are conversations that go on behind the scenes that then we're just like, we should do a podcast on this.
Yeah. And we have, 5 kids, so 4 boys and a girl, and of course spouses. And often when we're together, something like this comes up and we'll have a robust conversation.
If you want to hear a really robust conversation, just get us talking about shoes.
I don't even know what that is.
The old preachers and sneakers thing that Josh and Caleb always go back and forth on.
Right, yeah.
Shoes and jackets and all that. That's been a fun one.
We did an episode on that, if you're ever wondering. It's called Should Pastors Be Uncool Again?
Oh, yeah, right.
That's also something, if you're interested in, you can go back and listen to.
Yeah, so we're wanting to talk about issues that are kind of really going on. So in general, we have this tagline, the principles behind the plans, because we don't just want to be a how-to podcast, just a leadership discussion that tells you how to be better at whatever. I think it's helpful to have some people to talk about why we do things, right, about our principles that sort of guide our decisions. And a big part of that is covering some of the major, I don't know if you'd say news or movements or hot topics that are going on in culture that if you're a leader and you're following Jesus, whatever sector you're in, you probably want to know a little bit about and maybe have some understanding of in order to lead into the future. And so today, we are actually going to be launching part 1 of what's probably going to end up being a 5-part series.
Yep.
On a number of social issues. And so the topic today is sexuality, social justice, and the sacredness of life.
Yes. Which gives you the overview of some of the stuff we're going to cover. We're going to sort of, in this podcast episode, talk about some of the tensions around these issues in the church, not just in the world, which there are tensions there, or in politics, but in the church. And then we're going to try to take one at a time some of the issues that are a part of this discussion.
Right. So this will be sort of our 30,000-foot flyover of the entire, boiling pot that we have inside of the church of these major issues that are really hard to talk about.
Yeah.
I mean, quite honestly, I think that some of the value that we've heard from people about listening to the podcast is we do tend to talk about things that you don't typically hear about in a weekend message. And part of that is because some of these issues are just so sensitive.
Yeah. And honestly, too, some of these things we might talk about in a weekend message, but it's different when it's a conversation.
True.
Because then you can challenge some of the things that I say or vice versa, or ask some clarifying questions. We can take our time. We're not in a rush. You can listen to this at your leisure. So I think it just allows us to go a little bit more in depth on a lot of things that maybe we couldn't cover on a weekend.
Exactly. So the topic once again for today, it's an overview of sexuality, social justice, and the sacredness of life. And so we were just discussing before we got on to start this podcast the tension that we've experienced in church. And I was actually even asking you, so do you have stories that you could share? And you're like, not without exposing people. And I feel the same way. You know, I had specific things that I could share that are stories of craziness. But I think if you are attending a church in the West, but probably especially in the U.S., these are things that pop up all the time.
Yeah.
Typically, they're related to one of the party lines, Democrat or Republican, in some sense. I mean, they don't have to be political in nature, but
yeah. And so, I mean, I think we felt these tensions before the pandemic hit of the last 18 months of life. But I think the pandemic, the election, and a lot of the tensions that were going on across the country regarding racism brought to the surface the polarization that exists not just within the nation, but a similar polarization that is within the church world as well. And so when you say, do you have any stories of this polarization that you can share? I have watched it happen in my own church. I've watched it happen in other people's churches. But again, this is tough to talk about in specific ways because in no way do we want to dishonor anybody. And even in the way we're going to approach this, we hope that you don't feel dishonored by any of the points of view that we share. We're just trying to now, I guess, go into that really uncomfortable space of this tension and have a conversation about what followers of Jesus Christ can unite around potentially and where the tension, I guess, comes from.
And you were just talking about how you were driving somewhere through a rural part of Pennsylvania, I believe, and you were seeing the flags, the 2020 campaign.
So my first comment was I went to a church to speak a couple months ago, and as soon as you leave an urban space and you drive, especially in Pennsylvania, into rural area, when I arrived at this pastor's church, I said to him, wow, I didn't know Trump was still president out here because everywhere you look, there is a Trump flag or an American flag and big posters and signs. It's like the election of 2020 isn't over yet. And so in an urban space, you still see it sometimes, but nowhere near as pronounced. And there was a flag in particular that stood out to me hanging on somebody's house. And this one was pretty common. You might see it around. And it basically says, Jesus is my savior and Trump is my president, right? And it's almost like in some people's minds, those two things are married together. And so for some who are not Christians, they look at a flag like that and they're like, what in the world? Does that mean all Christians are Trump supporters? And then especially if they're anti-Trump, they like, how can you say you're a Christian and be a Trump supporter? And so that's part of, I think, the tension that comes is that there has been such, I guess, a part of the Christian church that's become married to the Trump/Republican Party and the issues that are presented there. And then on the other side, you can kind of see similar things. So in the title of this episode, Social Justice, there's also a social justice side that some people would see Christianity as married solely to the social justice cause, almost like they're synonymous. Not just that social justice is a part of what Christianity produces, but social justice and Christianity are synonymous, like they're doing the exact same thing. And there is that side of things too. And depending upon which side of the political aisle you land on, you may have had an emotional reaction to what I just described. Like internally, you might like, wait a second, how did you say that? Like, because this is so sensitive. It's like putting your finger on the wound anytime you bring up the topic at all.
Mm-hmm. There's, I'm trying to think of the exact term, but there's a term out there basically for trying to seek things that will challenge your beliefs. I think it's where you try to examine what they call disconfirming evidence.
Okay.
So there's actually a TED Talk that's called "What Does It Feel Like to Be Wrong?" And typically people are like, "Oh, it feels embarrassing," but that's actually what you realize. That's the feeling when you realize you are wrong. But we don't typically know when we might not have the full picture, when we have inaccurate evidence. And so I think what this is hoping to do is not to prove anybody wrong, but it's maybe to bring a fuller picture of what we should be thinking about as a church, as Christians, as followers of Jesus, examining what the Bible kind of asks us and prompts us to do. Because when you talk about these two polarized sides, just to give a little sneak peek of the conversation, it's actually really easy to ignore a whole half of what the Bible has, not half of the Bible, but a whole half of this issue in favor of one part of what the Bible says. And they're like, well, here's the Bible says, and that might be true, but there's also another part the Bible talks about, and it's easy to throw away half of it.
Yeah, so basically what we are saying, to start in the affirmative, there are some aspects on both sides of the political aisle that would be considered righteous causes. And it's very difficult if you're committed to only one side of the political aisle to see any kind of righteousness on the other side. You would see the other side is evil and we are holy. And so, but there actually is a righteousness on both sides of the equation that needs to be acknowledged. But that may mean, what you're saying, Dave, is that you have to admit that maybe in some ways the way you've been seeing the world is slightly off. You might be wrong about some things, and that's true for all of us. I think this is something they also call cultural humility, where you enter conversation with enough humility to admit, okay, maybe I might not be seeing this in the way that I need to. Maybe there's a different perspective I need to understand.
Yeah, and so the perspective we're coming from is a little different from a perspective that people who don't follow Jesus have, in the sense that we believe in universal truths that apply to everybody across cultures, and that what we're trying to do is to discover truth that applies to us all. And so when we talk about you might be wrong, probably what we're talking about is you might actually have an incomplete understanding of what we believe to be universal truth based on biblical not just biblical values, but on Scripture and on the commands of Jesus. And so we want to just dive into...
Well, what you said right there is powerful. That's controversial to some people, that God created us, that He designed us, that there is such a thing as objective truth. There are some righteous standards that He has in mind. Part of what we need to do is align with those. And so what you're saying is we're trying to seek out, how do we align with God? How do we align with Jesus Christ's opinions on things? And do that in such a way that also represents the kind of humility and tone that can be bridge building and unifying rather than polarizing. And so that is the tone and attitude we want to approach this conversation from.
Yeah, and what I love about Christianity, and just side note on the whole truth thing, is Christianity is not a Western movement. It started off in the Near East, birthed out of Jerusalem, spread to Africa, spread in the East, and then eventually came over, made its way west. And some people think of it as a Western religion, but Christianity is really universal, and it manifests the same core principles all across the world.
Yeah.
It's not culturally based. And so that's what I think is beautiful. You were just mentioning, somebody asked you a question, do you ever think all Christians will see eye to eye?
Yeah, actually it was Josh. We were having a conversation. So it's my son Josh, who's also on staff here at Allison Park Church. And we were having this conversation about the tensions in the culture. And he asked the question very sincerely, do you ever think there'll be a time in our lifetime when the church will again be all on the same page? Now, maybe that's naive to think that we ever were all on the same page. Maybe we were never on the same page and we just never really discovered it until the last 18 months. But will there ever be unity again around some of the things that we need to have unity around? And my answer, now maybe this is pessimistic, was I find it hard to believe that we will. Maybe there'll be segments of the church that will again unify, but it does feel very much like the church, especially in the U.S., there are people who fall. I think there's people who fall very much on the left side. There's people who fall very much on the right side, and there's people who fall in the middle that are just feeling the tension and the confusion, and everybody's searching. Do I belong to a tribe here? What tribe is that? How do I relate to people who are politically and have a different worldview than I do? And where do we come together as the church to be able to find common ground?
Yeah, and I think that there's actually a large group of people out there that sort of find themselves politically in no man's land.
Right.
They don't fully identify with conservative or liberal, Republican or Democrat, and they sort of hear people saying things, and you're like, yeah, sort of. I sort of agree with that. But it's been a season for, I think, a lot of people who would consider themselves to be reasonable people to kind of hide what they believe and to be a little skeptical and unsure just because it feels so polarizing, and the loudest voices are typically the most extreme.
Yeah.
So I think what we want to do, and by the way, I know this title is kind of intense sounding, Sexuality, social justice, and the sacredness of life. We're actually not going to even fully be able to dive into those today. Again, this is just an
It's a
opening.
tease.
Yeah, it's an opening to kind of get your appetite wet for the rest of this conversation. But why don't we start? Why don't we start to introduce these issues? You know, I know that you showed me this podcast. I believe it was a clip from Carey Nieuwhof when he brought on Tim Keller, and it was mind blowing to me. I was like, that is the most well said thing. I think if you just want to look up the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast, I think it's his first Tim Keller episode.
So I think it was back in March of 2020 or right around then, where he was
February,
or March, where he was interviewing Tim Keller, who is was the pastor at Redeemer Church in New York, and talking about this very issue of the polarization. So I actually heard about this clip from a good friend of mine, Pastor Brad Leach, who pastors in Philadelphia, South Philadelphia at City Life. And actually, I remember Brad last year in the middle of all of the tension of last summer. And he, like a lot of us pastors, was taking criticism from both sides of the equation. People on the right saying you are not standing up and speaking up for causes that we see as righteous, and people on the left feeling like you are not speaking up enough and doing enough about causes that we see as righteous. And he was saying, he put a little Instagram post out and he said, I feel like I'm a man without a tribe. I feel like I'm out of no man's land. I don't even know where I belong anymore. I'm fatigued. I'm tired. I'm doing my best to lead my way through this, but this is agonizingly difficult. And if you happen to be in a community where you have maybe both sides of the equation that attend your church or used to attend your church, at least, maybe some of them departed during the pandemic, you probably felt this tension. So as Brad and I were going through this we were just having a conversation over the phone. He pointed out to me this conversation that Carey Nieuwhof had with Pastor Tim Keller. And somewhere right in the middle of that podcast, Tim Keller said, there are 4 social issues, he said, that should unify all followers of Jesus Christ, all biblical followers of Jesus Christ. And then he named them off really quick. And he said, these 4 things we should all be able to agree on. And I heard those 4 things and I was like, absolutely. And then he said, 2 of them fall on the left side of the political spectrum and 2 of them fall on the right side of the political spectrum. And there's a tendency for the other side to ignore the 2 that they don't like to hear about as much. And that was like, wow. That is exactly what's going on. It was a perfect diagnosis of the situation. And we've named in the title some of those. Do you want to go through the 4?
Yeah. Do you want me to say them?
Go ahead. Yeah. Tell us the 4.
Okay. So on one, there's the poor and impoverished.
Right.
Right. So addressing those needs, taking care of them. Then there's what we call Christian sexuality, the idea that Tim Keller expressed that marriage is between a man and a woman.
Right.
Then there's addressing issues of racism. And then the last thing is the sacredness of life,
right.
You know, the
pro-life.
value of life, pro-life, yeah. Right.
So you kind of mixed them up. He said it in this order. He said the church should absolutely 100% stand against racism, should be willing to stand to help the poor and the marginalized. Then he said should stand for life and for the biblical sexual ethic. And he said 2 of them, the stand against racism and the desire to help the poor and the marginalized, tend to be issues that you find on the left, the Democratic side. And the other 2 issues, pro-life and biblical sexuality, are issues that you tend to find on the right, the Republican side. And he said, depending upon where you live, you can, if you preach to one side of the room, if you're in a liberal town and you preach on issues of social justice, you get people cheering. But if you bring up pro-life or biblical sexuality, everything goes quiet.
It's uncomfortable.
Yeah, and the other side around, if you're in a Republican side, you preach on pro-life and biblical sexuality, you get people cheering. But if you happen to talk about racism or you talk about helping the marginalized, that may not necessarily get as much cheering because, again, it's not the issues that we tend to gravitate to due to the political polarization.
I actually think it's probably even more intense than the way you phrase that. It's not just that we tend to not gravitate towards them. is that there's pressure to actually ignore that side, depending on which side of the political aisle you're on. And we just live in a day when there's so little bipartisan communication. In fact, we've talked about this before, but the way social media creates echo chambers where it feeds back things that you already believe, and the way that the media, the news on either side, Republican or Democrat, has tended to, make things more extreme and to sensationalize.
And there's almost a mindset to say, if you are for us or with us, don't give any ground. You can't give any ground, because if you give them an inch, they're going to take a mile, and we can't afford to lose this battle because this is the battle for the soul of America. And if we have to take our stand, we have to take our stand. So anytime it even smells like an opinion that someone on the other side of the aisle might have, there's a reaction to it. It's almost an emotional response that is a reflex now, because we've been so trained to be reactionary by the world around us. Mm-hmm. And yet, one of the things that we want to be as a church is we want to be both balanced, biblical, and we want to be bridge building, right? So there's 3 B's for you there that I just threw out there. That's a good alliterated sermon. Balanced, biblical, and bridge building, right?
You love the B's.
So part of what we want to talk about is actually all 4 of these issues should be issues that we agree upon. Like, in their essence, they should be no-brainer things for those who believe in the New Testament.
So let's back up. You mentioned these 4 issues. Why don't you just give a quick synopsis of what each one of these is, so that we can get a preview of what's coming up over the course of this 5-part series?
Okay, so helping the poor and the marginalized. That's the first one. That one doesn't sound really all that intense. If you say, of course, we have kingdom builders, we want to drill water wells, we want to help people trapped in human trafficking. But then there's the larger issue of the economics of things. Yeah. Like, do we raise the minimum wage? Are we for or against that? Do we...
Medicare, Medicaid.
Yeah, universal health care, socialism versus capitalism, and, that whole thing. So what is the appropriate way to advocate for the kind of change economically that would help the poor and the marginalized? Okay, but the root issue is we want to help the poor and the marginalized. The how is where the debate comes in, but I think every Christian can agree, yes, we want to help the poor and the marginalized.
But let's talk about why this is polarizing for a second. Because on the conservative side, there is this thing that nonprofits and churches and whatever should be the people to take care of that, and people should take personal responsibility, but the government should stay out of that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so there's this reputation, which, fair or unfair, is that Republicans don't care about those people.
Right.
And, as the church, this is one of our big concerns. I mean, it really needs to be a huge part of what we do.
Yeah. And so how do we address this in a consistent, systemic, partnering way?
Yes.
Is the question. Okay, so don't get, again, I just used a very important buzzword there, systemic. Like, some of you heard that word and you're like, oh no, what's this about? We're going to dive into that. I used it because, again, it shows the fact that we really want to create solutions, and now we need to talk about how. But I think that's an easy one. Everybody identifies. There is a second one now, which tends to be an issue on the left more than on the right, which is to be against racism.
Right.
Okay. Now, I think the easy thing for us to all historically agree on is the historic definition of racism, which is to discriminate against somebody based upon the color of their skin. I think conservatives and Democrats alike would agree upon that's wrong.
Most would.
Most. Okay,
yeah. You have extremists that are actually racist.
And maybe there are some people who would be branded to say, just because of their ignorance of the issue or their silence on it, that in and of itself perpetuates a problem. But I think in general, over time, the idea of discrimination against somebody because of their color is something that Christians, at the very least, should say absolutely 100% wrong.
Yes.
Now, there is then the debate about how to handle that. Like, what's the most appropriate way to deal with racism and all of the things that have been built into the fabric of Western society over time. And so there's a big battle around that. And this, again, has to do with how much is systemic and how much is interpersonal and where you fall on all of that discussion.
Yeah, and especially what the church's role is.
Exactly.
And so this whole thing is how we as Christians interact with these 4 issues. This is a big, hot topic, and it's weird because in some ways it's like, well, we obviously need to be against racism, but the church's active role in this just cause, right, is polarizing.
Yes, it is polarizing because I think because of the tone and because of the mechanisms involved in the discussion. How much should government be involved? How much should be imposed? How should we talk about this? How do we define certain words? I mean, it's really a battle over everything. Mm-hmm. But in its essence, Christians should agree that we want to be against racism. Now the question is, how do we deal with it, and what's the church's role? But in essence, we would agree with that.
And I hope that you're not hearing us take a stance like on these issues before we actually talk about them.
Yeah, we're not.
This is just trying to briefly define, and so we're not setting up at all the discussion yet. Just more of an overview.
Don't assume a conclusion just based upon the wording that we're using. We're just dancing around the topic for a minute.
We're not trying to say too much. Yeah. Okay. So we have those two.
Then there's pro-life. Okay. So life has great value. We're all created in the image of God, and so we want to value life. On the right side, this is a huge issue. The 1973 Roe versus Wade decision made abortion legal in the United States. Now there's a push on to allow for babies to be aborted up until the moment they come out of the womb. I mean, all the way till the 9th month, the final day. Okay, so that's been some of the debate. I think that it should be an easy thing for all Christians to say, we should value life. Mm-hmm. Now, the pushback on that is to say, well, all the right side tends to care about is babies in the womb, but what about when they're born? What if they are born into poverty? What if they're born without opportunities? Shouldn't we care about fostering kids and adopting them and making sure that people are cared for? What about the moms that are stuck in situations? I mean, it's one thing to be against abortion, but do you care about the plight of a single mom with 5 or 6 kids that she has to manage, and there's not enough welfare for her to be able to do it, or she doesn't have health care for her family? Don't you have to be pro-life the whole way? Okay, so the debate then broadens to how do we be pro-life from the womb to the tomb? How do we do that in such a way that doesn't ignore the value of life in the womb, but isn't ignorant of the other aspects as well, which then sort of flips the discussion into the 2 other issues that we just mentioned, the poor and the marginalized, and the idea of racism and social justice, right? That whole thought process there. Then the 4th issue has to do with sexuality, right? Now, the idea that God creates us as male and female, which is a very controversial thing now, that he created sex for good, for pleasure, for partnership, for procreation, but he intended it to be used within the guardrails of a covenant relationship in marriage. This means we're now addressing the issues of transgender, of LGBTQ rights, of the issues of identity. A lot of young people are now finding meaning and community by coming out as a particular pronoun that represents who they feel that they are. And so Christians would stand for a biblical New Testament perspective of who we are as men and women.
Male and female binary.
Binary, right? And what marriage is according to the New Testament and how sex is supposed to be practiced.
Sure.
Now, I'm currently doing a teaching series on Facebook Live on sex and sexuality, and I will just tell you, there is no debate in my mind in the New Testament or in the whole of the Bible about these issues of sex, sexuality, or binary creation, right? Mm-hmm. But there is a big pushback in the culture, in fact, really triggered and against the biblical values regarding sexuality, family, marriage, identity, all of these things. If you truly are saying, I am a New Testament person, I want to be a follower of Jesus Christ, then I believe the Word of God carries authority for us today, you cannot let go of the concept of biblical sexuality, or else you have somewhat left the context of what it is to be a orthodox, we used to use the word evangelical follower of Jesus Christ, because what you are basically saying is, I now reject the authority of the Scriptures in favor of what popular culture is teaching.
And we can get a lot more into what the Scriptures do say, because there's a lot of confusion out there.
Yeah.
There are some passages that are a little confusing, especially if you watch a TikTok video and you see somebody's very brief analysis of the Hebrew or the Greek or whatever. So I think,
but what makes a conflict so intense is that those who are on the left side of the political aisle who are constantly talking about civil rights from the perspective, we want everyone to have civil rights and everyone to get the protections that they need to have. There is an alliance between the civil rights movement and the LGBT transgender community because there is this push for civil rights there too.
Sure.
Which, again, not a bad thing for people to have civil rights. But it makes it difficult then if you're allied for the cause of civil rights from a political point of view to then point out the fact that you are in error biblically, right? So now here we are, we have these two liberal or leftist issues, and we have these two right conservative issues. And both, I think all four of them should be under the banner of things that Christians believe in, stand for, work for. But because of the polarization of these things, makes it difficult for us to all be on the same page.
So here's how I want to kind of cap this. I think one thing, and I wish we would have said this a little bit earlier in case somebody were to have not gotten this far in the podcast episode, but we want to handle all these episodes or all these topics, I should say, with respect and dignity to each group. You know, this is not going to be us roasting or making fun of anybody. That's not really our style or our heart. So this is hopefully a candid discussion. And I think it's partially, we were just discussing this. You said, I used to see myself as just trying to talk about the edifying topics, the encouraging things. Now I realize I can't avoid stuff.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, the thing that's just recently happened to me is I'm saying to myself as a pastor, when will somebody talk about this so that I can hear what they're saying and as a pastor learn how to respond to these things in the most biblical way possible? Especially, for instance, the sexuality issue is rarely addressed in church.
Sure.
Okay? So I've been like longing, when will there be a pastor, someone of significance who stands up and starts to talk about New Testament sexuality in a non-offensive way with a culturally humble tone? I'm longing for some answers in this. And I feel like the Holy Spirit said to me, talk about it. You do this. You've been at this for 30 years. So there's a lot of young pastors that are asking this question. How do I talk about this? Okay, so that's why we're having this podcast. But not just that issue. How do I talk about life? How do I talk about social justice? How do I talk about being against racism? How do I talk about helping the poor and the marginalized? Because honestly, I am 100% in favor of all four of those things. Now, the how, we are still putting a question mark on the how, right? So some of you are like, well, how can you be for all four? I mean, don't you know these people are, and that can be said from either angle. What we want to attempt to do is be a church that represents the attitudes of Jesus in the very intense places of life and tries to bring sense and meaning and purpose around how Christians can act and respond to all of these four key areas. In fact, the church is the one place, this is what Tim Keller said in the podcast, it's actually the one place where you can house a value for all four things. Neither political party is going to value all four things, but the church can be the healing agency in the world to bring people together around solutions on these four areas. In fact, I don't think there is any other organization in the nation right now that is able to do what the Church of Jesus Christ can do if we really do try to get on the same page when it comes to these four issues. And if somehow we can stand together and talk together and have meaningful conversations together around these things, and we study what the scriptures say, and we grapple with it, and we weep and we cry, and we go back and we talk again until we have hammered it out, and we're saying we're not going to let go of any of these values, and we're not going to let the world pull us apart, because that's what the politics and the news and social media wants to do. But instead, we're going to dive into the middle of it all and try to find common ground where we can start to work for the solutions that we so desperately need. And if the Church of Jesus Christ doesn't do this, who else is going to?
Yeah.
So I think we as pastors have to start to talk about this stuff.
Not just pastors, as Christians.
As Christians, but especially pastors and leaders. If we are not having culturally humble conversations about the issues of the day with the people that we are doing life with in our churches, so I as a pastor am not doing my job if I'm not in the game having this discussion. I know that's a very strong opinion because a lot of people, like you said, my preaching style has been in the past to preach on things that are personally applicable, totally encouraging, lead you to breakthrough, biblical, but are not controversial.
Mm-hmm. They could be confrontational about things that are going on in your life, but you've typically I mean, not recently, probably for 2 or 3 years.
I've started down this path even before the pandemic, but now I don't think I have any option.
Yeah.
Like, there is just, how can I not talk about it? If I just go back into issues that would be considered encouraging but surface-oriented or even just personal, then it really leaves everybody sitting there saying, I don't know what to do with this. I feel so afraid. I feel so frustrated. I feel like I don't know how to treat this person in my small group that has a different view than me. That is a huge issue that I think the church world is really grappling with right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. The very last thing that I just want to throw down a challenge for is for everybody listening, because I know a lot of people are not in full-time ministry or on a pastoral staff somewhere. But if you know, whether you are or you're not, if you're a follower of Jesus, my challenge would be to really open your mind to where you might need some more information or you might need to have some more conversations. I think it's really easy to see how much do I agree with these guys when you go and listening. But really, like, the way to get the most truth, the way to be most in line with Jesus is to come to a discussion like this, just willing to challenge yourself and have conversations. I was reading a book that talks about these 3 great untruths that American society kind of falls into. One of them is this untruth that life is a battle between good people and evil people. And I mean, there's actually direct scripture that contradicts that. But that's easy for us to think, oh, the people, those Republicans, those, you know, alt-right racists, or those leftists, those liberals, whatever, those communists, whatever people would say. It's easy to totally group an entire half of the country into something that is trying to take down all that's good and all that's right, and who ignores what Jesus would want. But I think that we have to challenge ourselves, to challenge our thinking, and to admit that we might not be right about everything, that we might not be fully informed, and that we might need to take a second look and to have some new conversations with people who see things different, because that's the role of the church anyway.
Yeah, it's good. What were the other 2? You said there's 3 errors that are existing. One is this idea. Did I put you on the spot?
Yeah, no, I know the second one. So one of the other ones, this is called The Coddling of the American Mind, is the book I read. It talks about like how, okay, so I know the second one is what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. And it's about how people think things that might be damaging to me will actually harm me in the long run. So it's this idea of avoiding trauma.
Okay.
And I don't remember what
so
the
it's
last one is.
So the seeking of a safe space where no one says anything unpleasant to me. Is that basically
that? Yes.
Okay.
And I think you see that, obviously you see that on college campuses. You see that manifested by people who also only want to talk to people that are like them.
Yeah.
You know, and yeah, so
we'll have to research.
What the last
we'll
one
have to
is.
research number 3 and mention that in the next podcast. but I do think the first one is true. The Bible says we battle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And part of what we have fallen trapped to is the idea that the people we differ with are evil, but it's really the devil and his demonic powers that are evil. And the people are loved by God, even though they think different from us, and they should be loved by us. This is one of the things that we've forgotten how to do, how to love people we disagree with.
Yeah.
How to, I mean, I'm not just talking about tolerate them. I mean, talking about how to deeply love and do life with people who have a different opinion from us. And you know, so let's say we can agree in essence that racism is wrong, but we have a difference of opinion on how to deal with it. Okay, but we can still love each other. Like we deeply agree that it's wrong to take a life, especially one in the womb. But we disagree a little bit about how to approach the change of the law or whatever. Okay, we could still walk in agreement. But for some people, that's like, no way. If they don't totally line up with the way I think, I don't even want to have anything to do with them. And this is where we need to mature as believers.
Sure.
Like, you have to learn to love people that think different for you and pray for them and bless them. I mean, the ethic of Jesus is love your enemies. Pray for those who curse you. Bless those who curse you, it says. Do good to those who mistreat you. This is the kind of thing we've forgotten the power of the gospel in these moments and how the attitudes of Christ lead us to a place of change.
Absolutely.
And so if we don't get to the place where we can at least tolerate a conversation with someone who might think different from us, then how can we ever be the bridge builders we need to
tolerate
be to make
a conversation where we listen and we don't have to have our own opinion right away, and we can maybe even silently disagree but show empathy for sure. By the way, the third untruth, I just remembered it.
Okay.
I looked it up, was always trust your feelings as the third one.
Okay.
So that what you feel is always true. And if you feel that, then it is. If you feel like, I'm not even going to go into it. It's actually a really good read.
Yeah.
It's
Coddling of the American Mind.
Yeah. It's written by someone who tends to be a little more on the left side of the political spectrum, maybe sort of center left. But they talk about how our polarizing culture and this new mode of thinking can really damage people in the long run if we're not careful. So it's really
review that. There are good people and there are evil people.
Life is a battle between good people and evil people.
Okay.
What doesn't kill you makes you weaker, and always trust your feelings are the three great untruths in our current culture.
Okay.
So
Wow.
it's really good. Anyway, that's kind of the cap on our first episode. So this is part 1 of 5. I think the next one we're going to do is going to be on the poor and the marginalized, right?
Right.
So look forward to this series. As always, we're so thankful for those of you who are watching and are listening, and we would love it. We would love it if you would please like and subscribe, leave a good review for us on whatever place you're listening, if it's on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, and share this with other people, because we want to get the word out, and we want to hopefully edify and help other people to be better leaders and followers of Jesus. So thanks so much for joining us. Any final closing thoughts for you?
And if you have any suggestions for topics for future episodes, we would really love to hear from you, because we want to keep the curiosity going, and we really love hearing from you. Email, DM, whatever you need to do, Facebook message, find one of us, talk to us. We would love to hear from you, because all of that's really helpful to us.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks for joining. Have an amazing summer week, hopefully, if you're listening to this, and we'll see you guys for the next episode.